An excess of information, a wealth of information, generates a poverty of attention. We spoke about information and attention. Herbert Simon said this 2 decades ago, and we didn't even have social media. It was not even on the anvil when he said it. And today, you compound that 1,000,000 times. So what is the architecture of information? Why is this that attention and information seem to be in a contrasting relationship? Think about words, meanings, and the behaviors that words, meanings generate. Think about the idea of, all of us must have heard the prompt that you get when you pay through Paytm. It says, in English, it says 50 rupees received. And in Hindi, it says 50 rupees or 50 rupaye prapt huwe. There is a whole world of difference between received and prapt. In received, it is transactional. You made a service and you got some payment for it. Prapt, the word prapt, encodes an entire civilizational worldview in it. It accounts for karma, it accounts for deservedness, it accounts for the mutuality of the transaction, and it tells you that you have a karma relationship with that person. So when you think deeply about the words and word meanings and associations, that is when you understand the importance of information and how information translates into wisdom. One more example, this comes from all of our experiences, whether you're a student or a corporate professional. You must have used the word roadmap. How many of us have used the word roadmap here, right? All of us, the minute we say roadmap, we see an image of a linear timeline, right? 5 years, 3 years, 10 years, 15 years. Everyone likes to project the future. But think about the word roadmap itself. It is actually a combination of two contrasting ideas. A road is a linear pathway. You have milestones, you can plan your journey, you can have your pit stops. But a map is a network of roads. You can have multiple routes and you can take multiple detours and still arrive at the destination. So the idea of the word, the metaphor roadmap, was that you, in any system, in any journey, and we've just heard this, in any journey, you need to plan both for the linear and also account for the exponential to make sure that the detours happen and the detours are interesting. If we didn't take the detour to writing, we would have never had that lovely song. So the idea that we've boxed time and we can predict outcomes is actually represented in the corporatized language that we use, and we seem to have a linear relationship with time. And when you understand this, you start questioning your own, your own sensibility, and you figure out the meta questions that might actually help you go through life. And then you start getting a perspective that if network of roads and linearity has to coexist in an individual journey, scale that up to a civilization. Think about 1.3 billion people with their own passions, with their own creativity, about their own journey, about their own meaning-making mechanism, living together for 7,000 years. Think about the wonder that is Bharat to actually accommodate all of these aspirations. It is this question about what is the architecture, what is the system design that we call the Indian civilization that prompted me to go from game design, which was also a similar concern but at a much smaller scale, to think about the architecture of Bharat itself. So I'll talk about what I've learned in my journey. Words and meanings, but before we get into civilization, since we spoke about word meaning, we'll talk about 3 words today: design, design thinking, and civilization. Before we get into design thinking, we need to get a sense of what systems are like. Think about this whole design itself. There is a stage, there is a cover, there is a camera angle. The minute when they decided to think about a TEDx talk and the university has to do it, there would have been the first artifact, a digital asset, a flyer, Instagram brochure, whatever it is that would have been produced as the first artifact. Now the artifact has to have some kind of interaction in it. You need to make sure that people are able to click on it, it is shareable, it is actually popping out, it catches the attention. So there is a next level meaning from the artifact to the design of experience with that artifact. But at the third level, you think about the architecture itself. If there has to be this place, if the poster is in a, let's say a junction, and people stop there at red light, then that is a behavior that is dependent on so many other people decoding it the same way. Your poster gains value only when people stop at that stop, right, at the red stop. And then think about the larger scheme of a government, a policy, a university, which are the systems which actually think about something like a TEDx or a talk like this, coming together is important. This is the journey from an artifact all the way to a system. An artifact is just a simple asset that we produce. Add the element of interaction to the asset, you get some kind of interactive asset. Add a little bit of collective behavior to that, you get a kind of a glimpse of a system. But then you go to the macro and you look at policy, you look at universities, you look at state, you look at civilization. Then you realize that the apex, at the highest level of imagination, is the imagination of how all of us come together to have the same coherence in our behaviors. An artifact is the simple question of what is the meaning of my life and how do I design it. He said the meaning of my life is if I'm able to express my creativity, and my creativity is in the service of joy for others, and that is actually bereft of my attachment to the result. Isn't it fascinating that the story that we just heard about a creator is the same story that Krishna told Arjuna? He said it is nishkama karma. It is the same impulse, it is the same question that animates all of us for millennia. So this is the idea of large-scale systems and complexity and behaviors. And we spoke about creativity. It's a function of knowledge, experience, and being able to connect the dots, which is the wisdom, which is the ability to tell a story using information. Now in games, this is what we do. In game development, a lot of my work was there. Sid Meier, for those of you who played games, Civilization is a very famous game. In fact, I was wondering if when I call it civilizational design thinking, there might be an illusion that I'm talking about the game itself. But Sid Meier has a very famous quote about what a game is. A game is a set of connected, related choices. And I'll come back to this in the context of civilization. When you think about game design, or when you think about anything that you have to create and put out for people to interact with, whether it is a TEDx talk or a game, there are three fundamental principles that game developers often use. At least the design element of that is that it should first provide autonomy. Autonomy means that the relationship between my choice and the reward or the punishment that I get as a result of the choice should be with me. It is agency. The game is something that somebody else is designing for you. When you watch a movie, you are still consuming somebody else's creativity. You're partaking in it. There is a rasanubhuti because you are able to arrive at the same level that the creator had. But in game development, in games, in interactive entertainment, it's actually more compounded because you are also having an agency to provide an input. You become the hero. And therefore, interactive entertainment is much more engaging than a film or any other medium because you have the illusion of choice. Even if you don't have the choice, the game responds to your choice. And the fundamental principle of engagement in game design is that the player should have the autonomy. And this is also true for our life. We would like to be responsible for our choices. We'd like to be told that whatever you have done is a result of your effort, and it is a result of the choices that you made. This is the civilizational principle of karma. We actually do not understand karma as a force, as a momentum. We have a mistaken identity of karma as something that is fatalistic. That is not how the civilization was built. Karma is actually autonomy. Karma is agency for us to deliver our own actions and be responsible for the outcomes that those actions have. The second important principle in game development is relatedness. Relatedness essentially means that there has to be a link between the second-to-second activity that I'm performing in game with what the environment is providing me. This is also called coherence across levels. That what I do as meaning making for me is also reinforced and complemented by the environment. So if you're a student at this university and you have a certain idea about yourself and your life, the environment around you should be able to complement that. And that is when there is a fostering kind of relationship between you and the institution. So in games, you have, let's say, some of you might have played any simple game where something is dropping and you're matching that, right? You're doing that, that is your second-to-second activity. It is actually giving you a way to engage with the game and interact and express your skill. But there is a larger game that is being played, a meta game, where you're able to say that if I do it right, I will get to the next level. And if I get to the next level, that is a higher demonstration of my skill, I unlock something else. So the external motivation and the intrinsic motivation is being combined and put together. And any structure, for it to hold, for it to endure, these two things need to always match. Your environment, your interiority, your ability to express yourself, and how the environment responds to that. And that is the design of engagement. And the third one is competence. We play games not just because they are fun. Fun is is the way we understand it, but it is fundamentally because there is an expression, a demonstration of our skill. The game becomes a venue for our skill to be expressed through the game. And it is the designer's responsibility to make sure that the player has that experience of competence. That is why you have levels. That is why you have boss battles. That is why you have roadmaps within games as well. That the game is taking you through a journey from a point of beginner to a point of mastery. So if you want to design anything, if you want to design anything that has to endure and engage people, you need to think about how are you providing the choice to people, how are you making sure that there is a consonance between their actions and the environment, and thirdly, you need to make sure that there is a line that the player or the person is able to draw in her mind about where the starting point was and how the skill is improving. Right? Now think about this in the civilizational context. I'll come back to what it means in a civilization. But the first word that we use, design. All of us intuitively know what design is. The best definition I've heard comes from a professor, Indian professor, a cognitive philosopher, Dr. Vinod Vidwansji, who's used Indian knowledge systems to develop an artificial intelligence-based bandish. And he says, design is the manifestation of intentionality. I want us to just reflect on this for a minute. Design is the manifestation of intentionality. There is intentionality there, the kriti, the creative impulse. And the first thing that needs to happen when the creative impulse is generated, and that is a divine inspiration, is that it has to envision what it means to the person who's going to receive it. While the creator's satisfaction is what generates art, the art is met with the aesthete. Right? So he says the intentionality is also critical, and design is the manifestation of that. Another way to think about design is that it's 3 nouns and 1 verb. Design is to design the design of a design. Not because it sounds pretty, but because it is true. Design can be thought of as a general concept or a policy. The design of TEDx, right? You have certain colors, you have certain camera angles. And then there is the activity itself. The design of TEDx is that there is a talk and there is a reception of that talk. You think about the intention. It's not just an activity without a purpose. There is actually an outcome imagined. And that outcome is that there is some knowledge, there is some inspiration, there is some networking that happens through this. And at the end, you also look at the final system. As a whole, what does TEDx do, or what does this conversation do? So 3 nouns and a verb is how you can think about design. And all of you who are looking at environmental design, you're looking at sustainability design, you will have to bring this down to the level of words, meanings, and metaphors. The difference between received versus prapt makes all the difference in the engagement in the way it is registered in our minds. If that is design, what is design thinking? This is a famous example, some of you might know it. The fundamental philosophical principle of design thinking, although it is not entirely deep, is abductive reasoning. In research, you always think about inductive research and deductive research, going from the general to the particular, or from a set of wide observations to the general. But design thinking flips that. And it says the way to think about new things, imagination, sparking imagination, is to ask abductive questions, is to reframe the reality that you have and ask, how might we do it differently? And there is something very subliminal that happens when we actually reframe the question. When you don't take what is given as the only way things can be imagined, creativity is the art of reimagination, and you ask yourself, how can I rethink that? We might not be able to say this, but this is an MRI scanner. This is an MRI scanner because somebody asked when they went to the hospital and they saw children, young children sitting in the hospital ward and feeling so intimidated. As it is, any visit to hospital is never pleasant. And you have young children who are waiting to be scanned, and you can imagine the psychological damage that they go through. You might not be able to help with all of that, but there is something in your competence, in your area of influence that you can still do if you're able to reimagine that place. So what they did was a bit of a storytelling around what that is. So they painted the MRI scanner, they made it a little bit more accessible, they made it more welcoming. By simply asking that question, how might we make this experience a little more tolerable? That is the magic of design and design thinking. All of you might be familiar with this. It has a 5-step process: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. We can get into it when we get a chance. But the way to understand all of this is principles. The principle is customer centricity. The principle is empathy. When it is enacted in any place, that becomes a practice. But a practice by itself does not really give you success. It does not endure. It has to become embodied. It has to become part of us. Think of customer service. Customer is king is just a principle. And you can have a practice that says we have 100 telephones and people have to receive it in 5 seconds. That is the practice. But unless the person who is picking it up has that memory internalized, has that value internalized, that customer is the king, that interaction will never actually yield that experience. So when the principle is embodied, it becomes a mindset. And then you can support that with techniques, with tools, with artifacts. It is this architecture that you need to imagine when you're creating something. What is the principle? What is the way it is enacted in a certain environment? What is the way it becomes a part of our conscience? How do we make it a conscious choice, an internalized choice that people actually exercise? And how do you support that? This is the architecture of a good design. And how is this linked to civilization? Spoke about design thinking, and I'll quickly talk about the Indian civilization. Like I said, my journey began with game development and creating fun experiences, working with creative teams, having a lot of fun just working in the job of actually providing fun and creating fun and the creative satisfaction that you get through that. But I realized that whatever we were trying to create here is actually a microcosm of what the Indian civilization created for thousands of years, and across such breathtaking diversity. When you try and make a game design, when you try and create engagement within a game, you're always worried about the system integrity. You always think about what are the elements of that system, what is the information flow, what are the feedback loops in that system, and finally, what is the purpose, what is the goal towards which it is going through. And that is very, very difficult. Game designers, game developers, technologists suffer with this. We agonize over creating engagement patterns within games. It's not easy at all, especially when you need to build a lifetime relationship with player. It is extremely hard. That is the holy grail of all games. But if this is difficult in a game, how are we managing to do this on the scale of a civilization? Sometimes the abundance of diversity, the abundance of heritage, the abundance of culture that we have makes us blind and indifferent to the value of it. You walk down the street in India and you see a 1,000-year-old temple. You walk down a little further, you see the same chant that was being enacted 5,000 years ago is still happening. Across this length and breadth of time, our lives are ephemeral, but civilization is eternal. How is that? How did they design this? They did not design this by force. They did not design this by actually imposition. They designed this by going back to those 3 principles of autonomy, making sure that we have choice, which is the principle of karma, that we have relatedness, which is the idea of community, from family to jati to kula to entire network of guilds that you have in Bharat. And you feel across Bharat, I come from the southern part of Bharat, I can walk into any part of Bharat and still feel that it is the same place. They were able to communicate the principles that bind us. The principle of time, the principle of life, the principle of meaning, the principle of succession. We haven't realized this, but Hollywood has. If you look at all the super hits that you have, global brands, there is a very, very strong Indian civilizational metaphor that comes through in all of this. You look at Star Wars, Inception, Interstellar, Matrix, you can add more movies to that. They have the core theme of the same thing, redemption, force. May the force be with you, which is what the Indian civilizational thought has been about. This employment of the philosophy in creative ways is also the principle of Indian civilization. It did not leave the thought at the philosophy level. It brought it down to each one of us in the form of itihasa, in the form of Purana, in the form of your folk tales, in the form of your local songs, your local dialects, your festivals. It brought all of this into our experience. The idea of sattva, rajas, tamas, which is the actual principle of equanimity. If you want to be sthita prajna, you need to generate your sattva. That is the way you do it. But that was not left as a philosophy. It was brought into the kitchen through Ayurveda. It was brought into our life as upavasa. It was brought into our relationship with time as ekadashi. These are the principles of the civilization that make us think and wonder. And there is an architecture, if somebody spoke about curiosity, there is a relationship between gratitude, wonder, curiosity, and then ownership. The minute we start thinking about the Indian civilization with this kind of lens about how did they manage to create engagement, what are those principles that are eternal, even as our lives are fleeting, you start first getting a sense of gratitude. You are grateful that you're born here because somebody has actually thought about all these things to give you that meaning. The civilization holds you. It is the cradle that holds you when you experience your success. It is also the cradle that holds you when you fall down. There is redemption in this civilization inbuilt as community. That is the genius of the Indian civilization, which has given us the way to express ourselves. These ideas don't come in a vacuum. The idea of detached attachment does not come just like that. It is a culture. So culture and civilization is the cradle that holds all of us. And when we think about it that way, we think about certain ideas, and I have only time to introduce those ideas to you, but I hope to spark interest so that all of us can read a little bit more about that. The first principle that the Indian civilization realized was that the entire world is sacred. There is nothing separating sacred and secular in the Indian imagination. That is why the way an Indian mind works is to build a relationship with a place. We make it beautiful, we do something around it, and we enter into a relationship with it. And for us, that is the truth. And this is what has been done across the land. The second one is the idea of a good life. The idea of a good life was not just given as freedom, that was not just given as money. It said desire, material well-being, combined with the idea of dharma, but also to the goal. Remember the system definition that it needs to have a goal, the goal of moksha. It made sure that all of our actions in life are sensible, because you pursue wealth, you pursue your desire, your creative satisfaction, but you also make sure that it is sustainable. Dharma is sustainability, that it will actually generate a surplus that somebody can use. And you do that only when you are also able to think about moksha, which is the idea of liberation from where the detached attachment comes. Then you think about the form and the formless. Also think about the idea of nitya karmas. To have, there's a school of environmental design here. The best environmental design principle from the Indian civilization is the idea of pancharana. The Indian civilization had always the biosphere imagination. It was a pattern-seeking mind that it saw the large patterns and it tried to inculcate that into the behavior. So you have a rina to your ancestors, you have a rina to the animals around you, you have a rina is a debt, a gratitude. You have a rina towards the devas who created this, you have a rina towards the ancestors and the biosphere and the animals with it, and you have a rina to your guru, to the transmission system that works. So I invite you to think about the civilization, the wonder that is Bharat, using the principles of design, and ask yourself, how might we become a part of this in a way that is meaningful to the next generation? Thank you.